And to close this session on royal histories and theories, we have Haley Potter with Like the Tide into a Breach, the Presence of Absence in Henry V. Haley.
I am thrilled to be offering y'all this Lancastrian nightcap. This is the face of Henry V. Not bad looking, right? Take a moment to really enjoy it. Henry biographer Christopher Allmand took time in his book to praise the king's, quote, thick hair, smooth brow, straight nose, long face, and sparkling eyes, unquote. This isn't a new narrative, as several Lancastrian courtiers spent a lot of their time in court writing anonymous poetry, saying that the king's body was, quote, well-formed and muscular, with bones and sinews themselves without violent or impudent signs, and that the skull of his head was round, a sign of great counsels and a man of wisdom. All in all, not a bad-looking guy. This is the face of Henry V, and it also isn't, at least not all of it. If you took a stroll through the National Portrait Gallery in London, you'd notice that this Tudor-era reproduction portrait is an anomaly amongst its royal fellows. In an endless row of three-quarter or full frontal royal portraits, this profile of King Henry V is bound to catch your eye. The question that I'm asking is this: what might Henry be hiding from us on the other side of his face? Let's go back in time to a hot day in July of 1403, as two English armies face each other down to determine control of the throne in a field just outside of Shrewsbury. One is the force of the House of Percy, led by the notorious Harry Hotspur, and the other belongs to King Henry IV, who is looking to hold on to a somewhat questionable claim to the English crown. We know that the fighting at the Battle of Shrewsbury was vicious and would cost over 5,000 men their lives. In an eerie echo of what fate would later befall the French at Agincourt, a large number of these casualties fell victim to the English longbow. 6 feet tall and with a draw weight of around 130 pounds, the longbow was capable of firing an arrow over 250 yards that could punch through plate armor. Clustered together in battle, a group of archers would all loose their arrows in unison, aiming their bows nearly vertically in the air so that the arrows would fall at a downward trajectory on their targets, a customary way of thinning enemy ranks before foot charges. This weapon was the machine gun of its day, quick to reload, accurate, and utterly deadly. In his account of the battle, Thomas Walsingham, a Benedictine monk, writes of the devastating effect that an opening barrage of arrow fire from the Percy's army had on the king's men, who, quote, fell like leaves in autumn after the hoarfrost, with every one arrow striking a mortal man, unquote. And it was into this shower of death that Hal would lead the left flank of his father's army. His head tilted upward to gasp for air or to shout out a rallying cry to his men, Hal raised the visor of his helmet and an arrow, fired by one of these Percy longbowmen, smashed to the side of his face, just below his eye, with enough force to drive the bodkin point 6 inches deep into his head. Miraculously, this injury did not kill him, probably due to the angle of impact. The fact that this arrow did not continue its journey and exit out of the back of Hal's skull suggests that it was perhaps one of those vertically shot arrows, racing back to Earth at an angle extreme enough to puncture, but shallow enough to be survivable. Some form of medical aid was administered on the field, with either Hal himself or one of his attendants pulling the shaft of the arrow out. Despite this grievous injury, Edward Hall's account of the battle states that Hal, quote, never ceased either to fight where the battle was most strongest or to courage his men where their hearts were most daunted, unquote. Holinshed offers a similar account in his chronicle, claiming that Hal refused to be evacuated from the field until the battle had been won, even though, quote, he was hurt in the face with an arrow, and that without regard for this hurt, he continued on with his men, unquote. Once victory over the Percys was certain, Hal was evacuated from the field and taken to nearby Kenilworth Castle for more intensive medical help. At the time, the treatment of arrow wounds was predicated on the hope that both the shaft and point could be removed together in one piece. If not, physicians were then instructed to push the separated arrowhead out of the body, either through a pre-existing entry wound or by creating a new exit wound. The precarious positioning of the bodkin that struck Hal, having him to rest only millimeters away from the top of his spinal column, made this usual procedure impossible. Nevertheless, physicians on the site attempted to remove the bodkin manually, first pouring hot animal fat into the wound, and then inserting their fingers into the cavity, poking and prodding to see if they could pull the bodkin free themselves. All these attempts would fail, and as Hal's temperature crept higher and higher in the days after the battle, it would become clear to everyone present that the life of the heir apparent was at risk. It would take the medical intervention of John Bradmore, a famed London surgeon, to devise a way to save the prince's life. In Philomena, a medical treatise where he wrote about some of his cases in his career, Bradmore sketches out a design for a pair of tongs, which you can see there, which could be inserted into the entry wound and then used to extract the bodkin from the prince's skull. But before this tool could be used, the depth and width of the already serious wound had to be expanded further before the operation could begin. Bradmore would not start his surgery until he could see the white bone of Hal's skull. After this process was complete, the prince would have been restrained, given some wine to fortify him against the oncoming pain, and then Bradmore would have inserted his tongs into the 16-year-old's face. Bradmore describes the moment of successful extraction as follows, quote, "I put these tongs in at an angle in the same way as the arrow first entered, then placed the screw in the center, and finally the tongs entered the socket of the arrowhead. Then, by moving it to and fro, little by little, with the help of God, unquote." With the bodkin now removed, Bradmore would spend the next month working to close the wound in Hal's face, holding it open as it healed with wooden pegs soaked in white wine and honey, and flushing the cavity out daily with more wine to ward off infection. This would have been a horrific process for Hal to endure. Fingers digging into the structure of his face, metal scraping against his skull, with nothing more to dull the pain and fear than prayer and wine. At just 16 years old, Hal had already learned firsthand the excruciating physical cost of war. As I've laid out, the fact that Hal was wounded at Shrewsbury is a matter of well-documented historical fact. All of the major chroniclers of this period, Adam of Usk, Holingshed, Hall, mention this injury in their accounts of the battle. These documents, let us keep in mind, will become the source materials for Shakespeare's Henriade plays, Henry IV, Part 1 and 2, and Henry V. In short, Shakespeare knew about this injury. So, with all the copious documentation from the period about this wound, you'd think that there'd be a comparable number of detailed accounts about the damage that it must have left behind. After all, no matter how skilled your surgeon might be, no one should be coming out of emergency medieval maxillofacial surgery without a mark. But this is the part of the speech where I have to come clean. There is no account from any contemporary source that makes any mention of a scar being left behind after this injury. Not even Bradmore, and all the detail that he'll take to describe the post-surgery care that he provided to Hal, will say in Philomena if the arrow left any lasting mark on the face of the future king. Now, I've got ideas as to why this fact might have been suppressed during Hal's lifetime. Both medieval and early modern English culture held the belief that the internal state of a person reflected on their exterior. Therefore, any spiritual or emotional failings were thought to manifest on a person's body, making them ugly or deformed. Shakespeare is clearly familiar with this concept, as he incorporates physical disability as a way to indicate inner evils in his characters. Richard III's twisted spine stands out in the canon as a clear example of this concept. This belief intersected with the historical Henry IV in the later years of his reign, after he developed a mysterious skin condition the day after ordering the execution of the Archbishop of Scroope. Many of his subjects viewed this condition to be a scourge sent from heaven, punishment from God for usurping the throne from Richard II. And at the time, this disease was considered to be leprosy, an especially biblically loaded diagnosis. Given the delicate transfer of power that would have to come for Henry IV to successfully pass his stolen crown to his son, Lancastrian loyalists would have had plenty of motive to avoid linking the disease that spread across Henry IV's skin to the scar on the face of his son. For the realm to persevere, the crown must pass from a blemished, literally and politically, Henry IV, to his son, who must be perfect, whole, and healthy in order to rule successfully. You might be wondering why I chose to focus my thesis on something that I can't even cite as a certain fact. Well, to me, all this confusion around the existence of the scar speaks to a larger understanding than just our historical picture of Hal. The absence of this scar is a window through which we can view the play of Henry V and how Shakespeare chose to personify Hal to his audiences. And since we'll be diving into the world of the play, I'll take a moment to clarify that when I say Henry V, I am referring to the title of the play. I'll say Hal to speak to the man himself, both as a historical and theatrical figure. When compared to the first two plays of the Henriade, it feels like there is something missing from Henry V. No longer the riotous prince that audiences and readers have rooted for, Hal is almost an entirely different character to us, suddenly bereft of the connections and relationships that helped prepare him for the throne. Hal is now a character without a past, intentionally severed from his youth, and a character without a future, doomed to end his play before he is ready, as the chorus is quick to remind us at the end of Act 5. As he works through the political and military struggles of his campaign against the French, there is a disconcerting feeling that Hal is, for the first time in his life, working without a script. For a character who has set himself apart in the canon as capable of making his own story, that's a pretty serious change. This absence isn't only present in Hal's characterization, but also within the overall narrative of Henry V, which contributes to a sense of alienation in readers and audiences. At the end of Henry IV, Part 2, Shakespeare promises all of us more of Falstaff's humor, but he began Henry V with that man's death. And by the end of the play, the rest of the Boar's Head gang will have exited the stage as well. Peto and Poins were abandoned in the previous play. The hostess and Bardolph will die, and Kistel will be left alone to fend for himself. Hal's English army is also full of the lack of something, which makes all of those really famous war speeches ring a bit hollow. No faith in their leader, as William complains in his fireside argument in Act 4. No common language, as seen in the chaos around the mines at Harfleur, and compared to the French army, not nearly enough soldiers to win this war. Yet, one of the defining moments of both the historical and theatrical battle of Agincourt will be the lack of English dead once the fighting is done. The most apparent moment of this absence comes when Hal orders the death of all of his French prisoners, an order that is given because of an impending counterattack on the field. Yet, one scene later, Gower and Fluellen will tell the audience an entirely different story. That the death of the prisoners was ordered because the French army had attacked the English baggage train, resulting in the death of the boy. The absence here is of the truth. The play will never specify exactly which order these events take place in. It is a moment of extreme textual distortion, and is often the scene that directors will focus on when they decide how they want to portray Hal to their audiences, either the white knight hero or the jaded Machiavel. Absence will continue to rule the narrative of the play after Agincourt. Once we've watched Hal conquer his doubts, conquer the French, and conquer Catherine, Shakespeare will undercut it all with a final speech that reminds us that none of the struggles and accomplishments and sacrifices that Hal's made throughout the play will be worth all of the effort. Never forget, and how could you, since by the time Henry V was first played, all of the Henry VI plays had already been staged, that what truly comes to define Hal's legacy is his inability to hold onto all that he won. Any legacy that he hoped to leave his son, a strong claim to France and a united England, will vanish with his death, creating the start of a power vacuum that will eventually lead to civil war. And then the scar that I am certain is what Hal is hiding from us in that portrait. If it is there, it would have served as an incredibly powerful symbol of military might and fortitude, worn on the face of a conquering king. After Agincourt, Hal's soldiers will have to strip their sleeves to show off their Crispin's Day scars, but his would have remained eternally relevant, no matter the calendar date. And yet, despite the clear relevance to the events of Henry V, there is no explicit mention made of this scar in the play. And there are plenty of moments where Shakespeare could have inserted this reference. The siege at Harfleur, the stirring moments before Agincourt, Hal's private monologue in the army camp, or the scene where Catherine gets her first good look at him. But instead we get nothing. And that absence feels intentional, especially since we know Shakespeare would have read about Hal's injury as he worked to write these plays. In his warning to the King of France, Exeter will characterize the upcoming war as a hungry one, waiting to open its, quote, vasty jaws and swallow everything that it comes across. The victims of this never-ending consumption are easy to pick out. The citizens of Harfleur, the staggering and sick English soldiers, and the dead who will litter the field at Agincourt. But it seems as if the very narrative of Henry V is eaten away by this war, leaving an overactive chorus full of apology and self-awareness to help guide the audience through the gaps in the play. And for a play meant to zoom in on the life and achievements of one of the most famous kings in English history, Audiences and readers often leave Henry V feeling less sure about how than they did when they arrived. That feeling of vertigo also happens after reading one too many Hal biographies, where authors give the Shrewsbury wound a one-sentence mention, no reference to a potential scar at all. I'm talking to you, Christopher Allmand. And then proceed to write multiple chapters on his economic policies. The point is, there is something missing from Hal's story. An absence that shows just as much on his face as it does on the play that bears his name. My aim with this thesis is to take a microscope to all of these moments of textual absence and interrogate what they can communicate to scholars and theater practitioners about an early modern perspective on someone as famous as Hal. A perspective that would have undoubtedly been shaped by the deliberate historical efforts to distance him from the scar on his face. This is the face of Henry V, and it also isn't. I hope now that I've got you thinking about what we might be missing from it. Thank you.
So you mentioned that, or you think that the absence of any mention of a scar in Shakespeare's plays is intentional. Do you think that there could be an issue of censorship in there as well? That there was originally at least a line or stage direction, and that was taken out by censors?
I'm not sure if I'd ever be able to prove that, but I do think that there is something politically fraught about putting on a monarch that you're not intending to portray in a negative way, like Shakespeare does with Richard III with Hal. You know, he's a popular guy. In the canon, he's not a villain, and I think adding that scar, Shakespeare might have thought has complicated that image.
Are there any examples that you're aware of paintings of royals in which a scar or any other form of I don't know, blemish on the ideal face is hidden or painted over?
So typically with these portraits, they are meant to sort of portray the idealized figure. They're not going to be painting in smallpox scars or wrinkles or anything like that, so I wouldn't expect it to be there. But the fact that it is in profile does make me think.
Yeah, just thinking of that final point, I mean, it'd be interesting to think that because of the two quartos of Henry V, there's a distinct possibility of self-censorship for wisdom's sake. So that might have been the case there, if that was going to be the case. But I seem to remember that Brandon Carter's Hal had a huge scar.
Yes, I've had a lot of awesome talks with Brandon about that staging choice. He was familiar with the historical wounding. He wanted to incorporate it into a Wren season. In the staging, since if you've read Dr. Cohen's essay, you know, you can't fire arrows into Blackfriars, they made it a part of the sword fight between Hotspur and Hal at the end of Henry IV Part 1. And interestingly, he is the only Hal that I've been able to find in a very extensive performance history review that incorporated the scar into the performance.
I have a question up in the back. Yeah, so I guess going off of that question, do you have a way of like maybe advising modern or current production on how to integrate the scar into the production, seeing as they just don't reference it, and how to make that work?
So I know asking theatrical productions to adhere to complete historical accuracy is kind of impossible, but in my mind, the impact that this scar would have had on Hal's historical character really lends itself to his behaviors in Henry V especially. In a biography that I read, the author posited that because of this scar, that's the reason that a third of his forces that he took with him to France were medical corps, because he had a very intimate understanding of what happens when you're wounded on the battlefield. So I think it really is incredibly relevant to what happens to his character as the journey goes on for him, and that is the reason why I would sort of advocate for becoming a part of staging.
So I was wondering if you thought that maybe perchance Shakespeare intentionally left out the scar because it would lend more of a responsible aspect to this rakish kind of laissez-faire character. So that, like, you know, in 1 and 2, he's kind of a roustabout, as it were. And if he was heading up a whole section of his father's army, you don't really get that same kind of screw-offy character. Pardon my lack of ability to ask the question.
I know in Henry IV, Hal does make the offer to enter solo combat with Hotspur textually, so I think Shakespeare is willing to suggest the responsibility that a 16-year-old would have had in defending the crown that will eventually be his. But yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure if it's meant to portray him as more serious because, again, when you think about Henry V as a military figure, you'd think that a giant scar that he got on his face as a teenager might be an awesome thing to reference before he guided everybody into that giant hole in the wall of Hartford.
Yeah.
You know.
I'm just really curious. Have you found any primary sources or historical sources that talk about scars or scarring in the Elizabethan time, like ways to hide them or make them up or heal them? I've never thought about scars in Elizabethan times. I'm really curious.
Yeah, I'm looking at both Elizabethan and early medieval to kind of hit what it would have been like for contemporary for Henry and then for Shakespeare. Right now I am more in that early medieval portion, but there are multiple treatises, both medical and sort of social, that talk about what to do if you have a giant scar on your face, which is basically stop going outside. And how wounds like that might be treated, like Bradmore's Philomena is one of those examples.
Jordan, let's finish off. Yeah.
So going back to the questions of censorship that were asked, I was wondering if perhaps the lack of reference to the scar in these plays had anything to do with contemporary audiences drawing parallels between Hal and Elizabeth. Like, I know that, like, she said herself, I am Richard II, but do we know if anyone made similar parallels with her and Hal, and if not mentioning the scar was a way of not scarring Elizabeth?
So I haven't looked into that specifically, but part of what I've talked with Dr. Cullen is the fact that there were constant border skirmishes with Wales going on at this period in history in 1599 when the show went to the stage. So there would have been veterans in the theater. You know, a scarred king, I think, is something that an early modern audience would have been able to relate to, at least for the ground.
Thank you so much.